Welcome back, everybody. You missed it, huh? You're like, oh, you were at the door, banging on the door. When can we get back? Well, here we are. As I was talking to the earlier lab, somehow, ironically, even though spring break is in the middle of the semester, really the second half of the semester tends to go much faster than the first half of the semester. Now, that can be a positive or a negative thing. It's all water glass half full or half empty. I don't know why that is, but it definitely seems like you come back from spring break and then like 2 weeks later it's finals. You're like, what? Which is good if you're like, hey, great, done with the semester. But at the same time, we still have like half of our content to go through. So we've completed exams 1 and 2. We've got exams 3 and 4 that we're continuing with our new systems. We're going to have our second lab practical coming up. So you see, we are in this week here, and our second lab practical is going to be a week from Wednesday. So that second lab practical, because we only have 3 lab practicals. We have 4 lecture exams, but only 3 lab practicals. And that makes it so that they're a little bit more staggered, which is nice. So that lab practical is going to include respiratory, right, and digestive. Those 2 systems will be included in lab practical 2 a week from Wednesday. Meanwhile, our exam number 3 isn't for a while, right? You can see exam number 3, lecture exam 3, covers digestive, urinary, and then a fluids and electrolytes and pH chapter, which is not another system of the body. What it is kind of a synthesis chapter. It talks about how each of a few of the systems we've been discussing and learning about contribute to fluid balance in the body and electrolytes or salt levels in the body and pH, right? So it kind of brings it together. So that is where we see ourselves going in terms of the lecture content as well. Okay? So, just wanted to set everything straight there, have our expectations set out before we move forward with, as I mentioned, digestive system. Now, the good thing about digestive system is that we've already been addressing it a bit in lab, right? So we're kind of ahead, if you will, in terms of our familiarity with digestive system. So we've already done digestive anatomy in lab, so we know the different parts. We'll review them very briefly at the beginning, like we usually do with a new system. What are the organs and kind of what they do and stuff like that. And then we'll work our way down, like usual, to the microscopic level. And in this case, microscopic even down to the molecular level, where we'll be discussing the chemical digestion that occurs as different enzymes work to break down the food that we're taking in and make it small enough so that we can absorb it across the body wall, put it into the bloodstream, and deliver it to the cells that they need in order to survive with their different metabolic demands. So we'll work down to our cell molecular level, and then we'll kind of scale out again, right? So we'll also talk about, okay, so how does this system work with other systems of the body? How is it controlled and coordinated, right? So probably we're going to come in and talk about how the nervous system controls the digestive system and how there are certain hormones that control the digestive system. And then there's also probably a little bit of this like local control as well, just like we saw with cardiovascular system and things like that, right? Okay, so that's where we're going in terms of our digestive system as well. All right, so we'll start out with some random digestive system facts. So the GI tract itself, the gastrointestinal tract, the alimentary canal, remember that is our main street for digestive system, right? So we have accessory organs that come in along the way, like side streets. Food doesn't go into those, but they contribute to the digestive process in some way. But the main street is the GI tract or the alimentary canal, and that's about 9 meters long. So that's a whole metric system thing. So a meter, if we convert a meter to feet, about how many feet in a meter? So a meter and a yard are about the same. How many feet in a yard? 3. So 3 times 9, that means that our GI tract or our alimentary canal is about 27 feet long. You're like, wait a second, like I'm not even 6 feet long in totality, and there's somehow 27 feet long of just the GI tract, right? Between here and here. Somehow there's like 27 feet there. But a lot of that we know comes from our small intestine. As we've seen in the models, as we saw in the cadaver, some of us, there's a lot of coiling, etc., that goes on in there as well. So surface area and length is going to be really important there because each organ is going to contribute along the way. They each have their job to do, and the food needs to be able to kind of migrate through it, spend time here, and then move there, and then move there. And the longer that we have it in there, the more it gives the system a chance to do its job, right? If it was just a straight shot, if it was a straight tube between your mouth and your anus, right, then that would be like a slide, a very disgusting slide. But like a slide where you just put stuff in and whoop, it pops out the other end, like one of those little toys that demonstrates that, right? You do not want that. We need to have time to break these things down. You're taking in very complex things. You're ingesting these things at the beginning, and it takes all of these organs working together to break it down small enough and simple enough that we can absorb it across the body wall and put it in the bloodstream. As you can imagine, whatever you had over spring break, in addition to the alcohol that you drank, I assume that you ate something as well. And those big things that you took in, there's no way you can float that in the plasma, right? We know that plasma has nutrients in it to distribute to our different cells of the body, but it has to be very, very, very small. And so it takes time to break that down small enough to get that into the bloodstream for transport. Okay, other things, salivary glands, an accessory gland that we saw in the microscope and on the models, produce about 1.5 liters per day. So again, metric system, etc. But you see those 1 liter bottles, right? 2 liter bottle is a bigger one. 1 liter bottle is half that. So somewhere between 1 and 2 liters of saliva that's produced per day. So these accessory glands are producing secretions that are going to mix with the food generally. They're contributing to digestion in some way. So a lot of secretions that are going on. So we're seeing some different processes in this digestive system as well. We're seeing things like ingestion, where we got to take food in. We're seeing things like secretion, where these different glands are producing secretions like saliva, like enzymes and things like that. We're also seeing things like propulsion, moving it through. The surface area of the small intestine is about 60 square meters. So again, a meter is about 3 feet square meter, right? Like this, 60 of those in the small intestine. Now, if you think about the models and the microscopes that we've been seeing, we know that, number one, the small intestine is really long, right? Number two, it has these circular folds, these plica circularis in it, so now we have that much more surface area. Number three, sticking off of the plica circularis, we have all those finger-like villi. So now we have additional up and down and up and down and up and down. And if you zoom down to a microscopic level, even smaller than what we saw in the microscope, those simple columnar epithelial cells lining it have microvilli on their apical surface. So on a very, very small scale, again, you have up and down and up and down and up and down. Lots of surface area. More surface area that we have means more places where we can digest and absorb things into the body. So it's kind of like, and I mentioned this earlier in the lab as well, like the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. Those are all about surface area as well, right? We have tons of these small capillaries where we do all the exchange with the body, and we have tons of these alveoli that give us a lot of surface area inside of the lungs for doing gas exchange as well. So surface area is big. Longest section of the GI tract, like we talked about, small intestine, that's about 5 of your 9 meters. The stomach itself, I don't know about this one. Every semester I kind of wonder about that. It says can stretch 50 times its empty size and hold about 4 liters. 4 liters. I don't know. You know, everything scales with body size, right? So if you had somebody that was really big, right, a really big, tall person, then maybe I could see that. But I would say for any of us, 4 liters would be a lot. But definitely the case is that the stomach While a lot of people, when they think about the digestive system, if we were to ask you, okay, name a digestive organ, that'd probably be the number one answer, right? Stomach. Because we think about the stomach like, oh, my stomach's growling, my stomach's full, my stomach's empty, and things like that. You're always talking and thinking about the stomach. And while the stomach does have digestive properties, where we're breaking down big things to small things, at the same time, one of its main functions is storage, right? It's a big bag. And those rugae, those wrinkles that we have inside of it, allow it to be able to expand so that you can take in a larger meal and then kind of like a snack, be able to digest it through times over a number of different hours rather than having to take in little bits of food all the time, right? So you can take in larger amounts of food that the stomach stores and then helps digest and then parses out a little bit at a time to the small intestine for further digestion. So it's a lot about storage. So it does have a big change in capacity, right? It can hold a lot of food, and then when it doesn't have a lot of food, it kind of shrinks down, and it may only be maybe the size of like the large intestine instead, kind of like an large like sausage-looking shape to it, as opposed to a big J-shaped bag that we normally think of it as. Okay. So those different types of facts kind of bring our focus on different parts of the digestive system and different things that it does. So let's look big picture in terms of parts of the digestive system. So we've already discussed this in lab, right, where we have our main street, our alimentary canal, and then our accessory organs. So alimentary canal, and as you can imagine, we can do a tracing there as well, right? We did a tracing with respiratory system where we followed a molecule of oxygen or something like that until it got absorbed across the body wall at the respiratory membrane. We could do something similar in terms of the food, tracing it through. And some of that pathway is going to be the same, right? Instead of the nose, we're going to have the mouth. I mean, in theory, right, you can take things through your nose if you wanted to. But the pharynx is where we have air and food and drink going through, right? So we'd have oropharynx, we'd have laryngopharynx, but instead of going into the trachea, the air tube this time, we're going to go posterior into the esophagus. That epiglottis is going to be closed, covering the trachea and the larynx, and we're going to shunt it posterior into the esophagus, where it's going to go stomach, then 3 sections of small intestine we know, right? Duodenum, jejunum, what's the last one? Ileum, starts with an I, ileum. And then large intestine, also known as the colon, where we have the different sections of it as well, right? So we have the cecum, the first pocket, in the lower right-hand quadrant, then ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, the S-shaped one, and then we straighten out to become the rectum, and then finally the opening at the end is the anal canal and the anus. The accessory organs along the way, like we said, are going to contribute to the digestive process in some way. But the food stays on the main street and generally doesn't go into these different accessory organs, right? Food should not go into the teeth, should not go into the tongue unless there's a hole in those things, and that's bad, right? Shouldn't go into the gallbladder. Gallbladder's for what? Bile storage, right? So the food doesn't go up into it. The bile is released from the gallbladder and goes down and dumps into the duodenum. Salivary glands, liver, pancreas. So they're each contributing to digestive function in some way, and we'll talk about that along the way. So there is our kind of typical outline of the different digestive organs, like we've been seeing on the torso models, and the purple plaques and the white plaque and things like that, showing those different sections and different both parts of the alimentary canal as well as the accessory organs of digestion. So what we have here is a bunch of different organs, and again, we'll kind of visit them. We'll kind of tour our way through them and talk about their functions and things like that. But what we have is a bunch of organs that contribute to this digestive system. And digestion is really, again, about taking big things and breaking them down into smaller things, small enough that we can absorb it across the body wall and put it into the blood. So when we look at how the food migrates from one spot to the next spot to the next spot to the next spot, it can be kind of similar to like a factory, right? So if you have a factory where it has an assembly line, within a factory, the idea is we have these individual parts where each place along the assembly line, somebody adds another part, right? They put a screw in, they send it down. They put this part on, they send it down. And at the very end, you end up with this product that is very complex. And they put it in the package and they send it out, whether it's a computer or a car or whatever, right? Bless you. But in terms of our digestive system, in this case, it's more like a disassembly line, right? We're starting out with something very complex that we're ingesting, and then we're breaking it apart. Each step along the way, we're breaking it apart further and further and further to get smaller and simpler along the way so we can absorb it into the body itself. So these nutrients then become available to the body and absorbed into the bloodstream if we get it down small enough, and that takes some time as well, right? Okay, so when we look at this process and all these organs and how they're contributing, we have these technically kind of seven different processes that are going to happen at certain places along the way. So we need to be able to define these processes, and I think that's one of your exam objectives. We're like, oh yeah, new set of exam objectives, new exam, new set of objectives, new set of vocabulary. And in fact, this week, I'm going to be taking a look at those objectives, and I'm going to try to go through them and try to make sure that they're all relevant. You know how sometimes we have like objectives where it's like, we didn't really address that and things like that. I'm going to try to head that off, and this week I'm going to try to work on those objectives and try to kind of clean some of those things out so that they're more streamlined as well. Okay? So I know that one of the primary objectives is to understand these processes, be able to define them, and be able to say like where they occur along the way. So for instance, ingestion. What do you think ingestion is? It's eating, right? So ingestion is where you're taking these large food items into the body. And so if we're talking about where ingestion occurs, where does ingestion occur? In the mouth, right? So with that particular process where we're taking food items into the body or into the alimentary canal, it really only occurs in one place, in the mouth, right? Now there are some of these other processes like propulsion, right? Propulsion is basically movement. If we have a big disassembly line, we've got to get it to move from the mouth to the pharynx, to the esophagus, to the stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine. It has to progress through. You guys all know, you've all had some instance in your life where things were not moving through properly. Too slow moving through, problem. Too fast moving through, problem. We need to move just at the right rate so that we have time to absorb things from it, but not too fast, right, that it zips through without us being able to pull what we need from it. But too slow, what happens is the body continues to do what it can. It continues to pull food items, nutrients from it, also continues to pull water from it. And so that's why you can become constipated if things are moving too slowly, because your small intestine and your large intestine just do their job. They're like, yep, going to continue to pull water from it, and it makes it very, very hard what's left over and hard to move through the rest of those colon segments and things like that, okay? So, point being though, propulsion as one of our different essential activities or processes occurs at basically every place along the way, right? It has to be propelled or moved all through the system. So some of these processes are very specific for places where they occur, and other ones occur almost everywhere. But you've got to be able to understand each of these and then give examples of where they occur. Now, I tell the same story every semester, but it's new to you, so it's new, okay? So ingestion, I was going through these one semester, and we were talking about ingestion and how it only occurs in the mouth. And I had a student raise their hand, because we were talking about, you know, the things you eat, because we were often talking about food, but the things that you drink are very important as well, right? Electrolytes, there's nutrients in there, water is really important, so drinking's super important for this digestive system as well. And we were talking about the things that you drink and how it goes ingest in the same way, and I had a student raise her hand. She's like, well, you know, there's also coffee enemas, how about that? I'm like, how about that? What? The what? So I don't know if it's still a thing, because this was a number of years ago, but apparently that's a thing, right? So here's the deal, right? The small intestine and large intestine, like we said, are a lot about digestion, but they're also about absorption. That's where we pull it across the body wall. And for something that's very simple, like a fluid that has electrolytes or nutrients in it or something like that, technically you could probably bypass some of these other segments, right? Like if you have a smoothie, you don't have to do a lot of chewing in your mouth in order to send that down, because that processing, that physical digestion has kind of already occurred. It's all blended up. So if you had some sort of a drink like coffee, and you wanted to ingest the fluids and the electrolytes and the caffeine and stuff like that, technically, you could send it up that way and it could be absorbed across the body wall and it could still get in. There was some sort of a trend where it's like, oh, if you absorb it that way, it's much faster and it's much more effective and blah, blah, blah. I'm like,
I think I heard the same thing about alcohol, actually.
right? Shotgunning things.
Yeah, but it bypasses all your other like systems that keep you from like overdosing. So when they put drugs and alcohol and whatever, not only is the yeast, oof, but
Yes,
like
fermentation,
all that
right?
Sugar, yeah.
Yeah.
But like the enteric coated and stuff like that, it doesn't.
Right? There's a whole
And you
series.
can, like,
If you try to
overdose
shortcut the
so
system, the system has evolved over millennia to work a certain way. And so if you try to shortcut the system, it's probably going to end up poorly. So I don't know. So in any case, you know, if you have like a enema bag and you're sitting in your bathtub enjoying your coffee that way in the morning, scrolling your Kindle, I don't know. It could be okay, but generally we're accepting that ingestion occurs here in the mouth only. Okay, so we're going to go on that assumption that ingestion is occurring that way. Defecation is at the opposite end, right? This is where our indigested or undigested food products are exiting the system, where we pull everything that we need out of it, and now we're getting rid of things that we can't digest or we don't use, etc. So ingestion, we saw that one. Defecation, propulsion's movement like we were talking about. Now digestion. Digestion breaks into two, right? So we have mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. Digestion on a basic level is taking something large, some sort of large food item, and breaking it down into smaller components, right? So that hopefully you can absorb it into the bloodstream. So mechanical digestion is a physical process. You can also call that physical digestion. So as you can imagine, the teeth chewing things and mashing them up, that's a type of physical digestion. It started big and it got smaller, okay? Churning of the stomach with its 3 different layers of smooth muscle, right? Circular, longitudinal, and oblique muscle layers in the stomach. All of that churning in the stomach also counts as a type of physical digestion. Chemical digestion, on the other hand, is where we have enzymes that will be secreted from different accessory organs along the way, in even sometimes primary organs. And chemical digestion is where we're actually breaking chemical bonds. So we're starting with larger molecules, more complex nutrient molecules, and we're breaking them down into smaller subunits, okay? So chemical digestion is breaking chemical bonds, but still going from bigger to smaller. Okay, so then we have absorption. So absorption is going to be key because we go through this whole process of breaking things down. We've got to get them into the body wall. So right as you have food in your stomach right now, technically your stomach and your intestine is kind of like a suitcase. Right now you're just a meat suitcase carrying the food that you had at breakfast along, but at any time, if you needed to, you could empty the suitcase. It's not how it's supposed to work, right? If there was something wrong, you could throw up and get rid of that, and it never actually entered the body. You were just carrying it for a period of time. The only time it enters the body is when it goes across the body wall, when we absorb it. So just like when we were talking about the lungs, we were talking about ventilating the lungs. That's great to breathe and ventilate the lungs, but unless oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange, your body isn't getting the benefit of that. So unless absorption occurs, and we actually absorb it, mostly in the intestine, but other places absorb a little bit as well, absorption is going to be a key step that we need it to occur. So that's mostly in the small intestine, but you do get some in the mouth, you do get some in the or in the stomach, in the large intestine, etc. And then finally, we have secretion. So we had an example of secretion early on when we were talking about the salivary glands, right? They produce a secretion. Bile, that's a secretion. Stomach acid, that's a secretion. Pancreatic juice, etc. All of those things are secretions that are released by these different organs, and they mix with the food itself. So they're going to help the digestive process in some way. Help the food to move along, right? Mix it with the saliva so it's a mushy bolus as opposed to kind of a hard, if you're chewing up chips or something like that and you swallow them and they're really hard and angular, you could damage your digestive system. So secretions are going to help the digestive process along the way. And secretion occurs in many different places. Certainly the mouth, right? Salivary glands, like we said. Duodenum, where the pancreas, right, is releasing its secretion. Stomach acid, so it occurs in the stomach. But also think about how, when we looked at the microscope, remember we had 4 different layers to the alimentary canal, right? What was the innermost layer called? Starts with an M. Mucosa. We had mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa, right? 4 layers. Number 1, submucosa often has glands in it. Oh, right, duodenal glands, things like that. But also, the mucosa layer has those goblet cells in it. So we're secreting mucus. This is a mucus line pathway because it opens to the outside. So technically the whole pathway does secretion. We have mucus being secreted as well. So that one, secretion, like propulsion, those ones really occur all throughout our digestive system, all throughout our alimentary canal. Okay. So this graphic here shows some of those different digestive processes and highlights some of the places where they're occurring. Ingestion, like you see there, mechanical and chemical digestion, give some examples. Propulsion, absorption, defecation. The only thing this one doesn't show is that secretion. And secretion definitely does occur and is an important process as well. Okay. This slide right here, when we're talking about propulsion, how it's important to move things along, we know that this is a muscular tube. We see that in the microscope. When we looked at the stomach or the duodenum or the ileum, we saw that we have a smooth muscle layer, a tunica muscularis or muscularis externa. So we have a muscular layer throughout this whole tube to get that propulsion to occur. And that's what we see kind of on the left-hand side here. Left-hand side, this is an example of peristalsis. So we have these peristaltic waves, these rhythmic waves that will squeeze the food down and keep it moving so it doesn't get stuck in any particular place. So that's coordinated, as you would imagine, by our nervous system, the rhythm of those waves, etc. We can slow it down, we can speed it up. But in addition to that movement, that propulsive movement of squeezing the tube, and you can imagine how both circular and longitudinal muscle would work there, right? So you can see how the circular muscle can pinch it off, and then the longitudinal muscle can squeeze it down, like squeezing a toothpaste tube. So we can get it to move from one end to another, right? So that propulsive movement is an important aspect of the muscular activity of the tube. But also on the right-hand side there, you see another example of muscular movement that is more of a physical digestion as well. So we talked about churning of the stomach. What you're seeing there is called segmentation. So segmentation occurs in the small intestine as well. And what that is it's a kind of a back and forth squeezing. So back and forth, pinching and squeezing so that we actually mix up the food that's in there. We're mixing it with the digestive secretions and the enzymes. Much like, right, if you have a washing machine, when you put the clothes in there, there's some sort of an agitator. There's something that mixes it around all the time. You don't just dump clothes in there and dump the water in there and it just sits, right? It's not going to get clean that way because we want the fluid, that's the secretion, and the enzymes and the detergents, like emulsifiers and things like that, to get in amongst all of the food that's maybe on your clothes instead. And the system that you have for the digestive system is doing that as well. So segmentation is where we're doing this type of pinching back and forth, a moving back and forth where we mix the food with a lot of those secretions. So this is kind of like kneading dough, right? So those, if you have a big thing of dough and you're trying to mix things together, just grabbing it and pinching it and pinching it and pinching it back and forth kind of separates it into different smaller bits that then end up mixing together, okay? So segmentation is another type of muscular activity that we get in this tube, but that is a type of physical digestion. This is more of a propulsion, an example of propulsion, and this is an example of a physical digestion that occurs most commonly in the small intestine. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a system that is technically an external environment for this digestive process. Like we said, you're kind of carrying these things around, breaking them down until you can absorb them across the body wall. And in order to coordinate all of these different parts of this disassembly line, we've got to regulate or make sure that these things are in sync with one another. They're coordinated as well. So when we have different types of activities we need to adjust and monitor, it's all about feedback loops. Every time we get to a system, it's about, okay, we've got receptors that tell us what's going on. We've got some sort of control center that says, okay, how are we doing where it should be and where it is now? Are those close or are they different? Do we need to make adjustments? And if we need to make adjustments, we have effectors, right? We have motor output, we have effectors that then tweak it to make sure that it's doing what we need. So in terms of receptors, lots of different types of receptors that tell us what's going on in this digestive system. We need to know overall, what are we getting out of the food that we're getting? Are we getting enough nutrients? Are we getting enough water and things like that? But also, how's it moving? Like when we have a load of food in the stomach, well, how's the small intestine, how's the duodenum doing right afterward? Is the duodenum busy? Do we need to slow down the stomach activity until the duodenum is ready and then we can move it on? Or is the duodenum immediately ready? So go ahead and send it down, right? So there's this communication along the disassembly line where we can make sure that each part of the system is coordinated with other parts, right? So just like if you swallowed something immediately, you wouldn't be able to swallow something right afterwards, right? You got to give it some time. You can feel it go down, and then once it's kind of passed, now you can send something else down, right? So even that ingestion process can be regulated. So we have lots of different types of receptors that tell us what's going on. Mechanoreceptors, which tell us whether we're full or empty or whatever. Chemoreceptors, which tell us, oh, okay, so what type of food did we ingest? Is it really fatty? Does it have a lot of protein? Does it have a lot of carbohydrates? That's going to be important in terms of our nutritional needs, but also it's important in terms of the digestive enzymes that we secrete to break it down, right? If you've got a really kind of fatty meal that you're taking in, then you're going to need a lot of that bile, because we know bile helps us to digest fats in certain ways, and some specific digestive enzymes that are going to work on fats as opposed to proteins, as opposed to carbohydrates, right? So the body needs that feedback as well. So different types of chemoreceptors that tell us about what's in the tube as well. And then, of course, our main area of the body that's going to be coordinating this is going to be our central nervous system. So ultimately, right, we have to have areas of the brain that get this information that can then coordinate it with the activities of other organ systems. So if you are not doing too much, if you are a couch potatoing, that doesn't burn a lot of energy. The whole idea is you're taking in these nutrients to supply the body with what it needs. And if you're not doing much, if you're not burning through a lot of energy, then you don't have a lot of needs. And that's okay, we need to match that, right? But if you're in training for something, if you're doing a lot of activity, then, your needs are going to increase. So we need to match that. So generally, the amount of food that you're taking in is supposed to match the nutritional needs, the energetic needs of the body. As we were talking a little bit before in the earlier lab, there's a lot of things that goes into how much food you eat, right? A lot of things. We don't have time to go through all that. But if you think about it, when you're eating, certainly you have this awareness of, okay, it needs to be nutritious. It needs to be healthy and things like that. It needs to be in balance. It shouldn't just be, we ate straight butter. Just unroll it, just cut off slices and just eat butter. you have some sort of knowledge in there, even though you're not a dietitian, that that's probably not so good for you. And that's probably just one aspect of the nutrition that you need, of the nutritional needs that you have. And you need other things. You need proteins, right? You need fiber, and you need other types of electrolytes and things like that, right? So it needs to be balanced as well. So our extrinsic system is working to balance that and coordinate that, but also it's affected by, like, why else do you need? Or why else do you eat? So you might eat just because you're bored. It's just right there, right? You might eat just because you're like, oh, I really love that food. And so whatever that particular food is, if that's your favorite food, you're like, okay, I had some. I feel kind of full, but I really want some more of that. So I'm going to have some extra. I can handle that, right? I'm going to have some extra because that birthday cake or whatever is really good. I'm having an extra slice. I don't need it. I want it, right? There's also social aspects of eating. Oh, we're going out to dinner. We're going out to drinks and whatever, right? That may not necessarily coordinate with your body needs at the time. It's just like, oh, well, we're meeting at 5 o'clock because that was a good time for everybody. I'm not really hungry, but I'm going anyway because it's a social thing. So lots of different things that come into play in terms of the foods that go in and how much that come in. But the nervous system has to coordinate that as well. So not only is there extrinsic control by the central nervous system, giving us an idea about what our intake is and what our needs are, but there's also some intrinsic control as well. So there's actually communication by what's called an enteric nervous system that's intrinsic, that communicates between these different sections of our disassembly line. So that, like we said, our stomach can communicate down to the duodenum, or duodenum back up to the stomach, saying, duodenum, I'm really busy with all the food you sent me just a little while ago. Don't send me any more. Slow down. Don't send me any more for a while until I let you know I'm done with this. Once I shove this down to the jejunum, now I'm ready. Okay, give me some more, right? So there has to be that coordination along this alimentary canal as well. So that's part of our intrinsic system as well, where these organs can communicate directly between each other using kind of like an intranet, a within company, if you will, communication system, so that we can coordinate that activity. And that's kind of what we see here, right? So what we're seeing here is we can see how that feedback mechanism can be used both locally as well as kind of extrinsically, where we're going to have the stimulus with whatever we put into that alimentary canal. So we're going to have mechanoreceptors telling us that our intestine is full or our stomach is full or empty. Chemoreceptors looking for particular chemicals. Osmoreceptors looking at concentration overall. And that will then affect how this system works. Like, do we need to increase the propulsion, the muscular activity? Do we need to add more secretions in? Things like that, right? If you are fasting or something, you're just drinking water. All right, so if I put a bunch of water down there, I can fill my stomach with water. And mechanoreceptors say, oh, I'm full. That's good. I don't need anything for a while. But fluids move through there pretty fast. So if you're just adding fluids down there, it's not going to stay very long before those mechanoreceptors are not going off very much. And now the brain's like, hey, my stomach's not very full. It's kind of empty now. Hey, how about some more stuff going in there, right? So it kind of depends on what's going in there and how long it stays there and what it is as to these feedback loops and what type of activity we need. So you can see how we can have little short-term things, right? If this is the duodenum, like I said, and it's very full, then it may communicate back to like the stomach and say, hey, don't send me any more stuff in this enteric nervous system until it's ready. But it's also going to send signals back to the central nervous system, back to the brainstem, because like we said, brainstem is more about just keeping you alive. It's not about creativity, like, what am I going to cook? Does it look beautiful and stuff like that? It's more about what nutrients do I need, right? So we're going to be still down in the brainstem again. It's going to feed back to the brainstem, and the brainstem is going to be coordinating that. Oh, I get it. You know, we're starting to kind of have some room in the stomach, but I know later on in the day I have a plan to go on a hike or something like that. So I better start maybe loading in some carbs or something because my nutritional needs are going to go up, and my brain, my higher brain centers know that. So we have to have this coordination with the extrinsic long reflexes as well. Okay, so this slide just talks about and reminds us of some of those different receptors that are giving us information about what's going on with the system at the time. So chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, etc., are telling us what we've eaten, how much we've eaten, what it's made out of, and kind of what we need to do about it. So they're going to initiate reflexes that may then slow down or speed up digestive glands. So again, if I'm filling my stomach with water, I probably don't need to release a lot of digestive enzymes to digest that water, right? So we actually have receptors in there that can say, oh, was there a lot of food in this? There's not a lot of food in it. Now, if I take a smoothie in, oh, well, there's a lot of nutrients in that, right? So that may elicit some sort of activity with digestive glands where we're going to be breaking down some of those nutrients, etc. But also, like we said, kind of the mixing of it and the size of what we're eating is going to be an important aspect of it to make sure that we've had time to mix with these secretions and help to digest it and then move it along as well. Okay. So that was kind of talking about a bit of that big picture about the system, how we have all these different organs of the system, and how we need to kind of coordinate the system to match the needs of the body itself. So still in kind of a big picture, before we get on to talking about individual organs and what they do, is we do have to kind of reflect on the fact that this system, how it sits in the body and kind of how it relates to other systems physically as well. So just like we did for a cardiovascular system where we're like, oh, the heart sits in the pericardial cavity, and there's a visceral pericardium, there's a parietal pericardium, and we talked about the lungs. Now they sit in the pleural cavities, and they have a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura and stuff like that. Same thing we see here in terms of the digestive organs. So overall, our digestive organs themselves sit within, for the most part, the abdominal pelvic cavity. And not all of them, right? Mouth's way up here. Esophagus is going through the thoracic cavity. Oh, okay. But then, as we get down here, where most of our digestive organs are, we get down to that abdominal pelvic cavities. And so in the abdominal pelvic cavities, we have serous membranes again, like we saw with the thoracic. And so in this case, they're called peritoneum. So rather than pericardium, rather than pleura, now we have peritoneum. And so you're going to have both parietal and visceral layers of your peritoneum. So the visceral layer, the visceral peritoneum, is going to be right on the surface of the organ. So it's going to be on the outside of the stomach and the outside of the intestines and things like that. So that when these organs are doing all their mixing and squeezing and things like that, they're able to be slippery and move past one another without generating friction. Okay? So the visceral peritoneum covers the external surface of most of our digestive organs. And in fact, when we looked at our 4 layers of the alimentary canal, we have mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Serosa is serous membrane. That's what we're talking about. That thin, simple squamous epithelium that's right on the very outer layer of our tube, that's the serous membrane. That's the visceral peritoneum. Okay? Now there's also the parietal peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal pelvic cavity. So again, as they're squishing and moving and stuff like that, they're not generating friction along the side of the abdominal cavity either. So in that way, we have these lubricated digestive organs that are very slippery, moving very easily next to one another as they're performing their activities. Okay. In addition to serous membranes, we have different types of connective tissues that help to hold these digestive organs where they belong. So every time when we look at these digestive models, we've seen that the stomach is in the upper left-hand quadrant, and the liver is in the upper right-hand quadrant, with the gallbladder underneath it. The pancreas is deep to the stomach. The cecum, the first pocket of the large intestine, is in the lower right quadrant with the appendix hanging off. So it's organized in a very particular way. So even though it's a bunch of squishy organs sitting in this big cavity, somehow they're not just all piled up in your pelvis down at the bottom due to gravity, right? And that has to do with the connective tissues that suspend these organs to the body wall and connects them to each other so that they don't kink up, so that they're located in this particular place that gives them the room to operate as they go and add to the digestive process. So what we're going to have is different types of connective tissues, and one of the main ones is called mesentery. So mesentery is going to be connective tissue that goes and connects a lot of these organs, like I said, to each other and to the body wall. Not only does it help to connect them and suspend them, but it also gives a direct pathway for blood vessels and lymphatics and nerves and things like that to get to and from these organs and connect with the major blood vessels of the body. So, those that saw the cadaver, we saw some aspects of the mesentery and those connective tissues as well. You don't often see them on figures and models and things like that because they're just like, again, like webby connective tissue everywhere. And so it kind of can obscure the view of your different organs, like being able to see the liver and the gallbladder and things like that. But they certainly do exist, and we'll see a few examples of mesentery coming up. Now, most of our organs are going to be, like we said, in the peritoneal cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So most of our organs are going to be what are called peritoneal organs. But there are a few that are what are called retroperitoneal. So retro means back behind, right? So if something's retro, it's like vintage, it's from back beyond. And so there are a few sections of our abdominal organs that are back behind that peritoneal membrane. So like aspects of the pancreas, which are deep there, some coils of the small intestine are actually back behind that curtain of the serous membrane of the peritoneal membrane. But these are some examples of some of our connective tissues like we see here. So in fact, off of here, there's what's called the greater omentum. So see where it's yellow right there? In fact, there should be a whole kind of connective tissue and fat apron that goes all the way down here and helps to hold all of those coils of the small and the large intestine in place. And it comes off of that greater curvature of the stomach. You can see a lesser omentum coming off the lesser curvature of the stomach here, and see how it connects the stomach to the liver and the gallbladder and things like that. In addition, there's that greater omentum. See that kind of fat apron I was talking about that's kind of lifted up in this case? Here you can see some of the mesentery connecting to the small intestine, helping to hold it in place and hold to the body wall. And then there's also what's called the mesocolon. So this is connective tissue holding the colon. So that again, we have ascending colon on the right side, transverse colon along the top, descending colon along the left side, right? So all that has to be suspended in place. So mesocolon helps to hold the large intestine or the colon in place as well. So there are a bunch of different connective tissues that are important in terms of organizing all of these organs of our disassembly line. This figure isn't a lot of information, but it just shows you remember how we said that there are some organs that are retroperitoneal? So you're looking down inferiorly at the abdominal pelvic cavity. There's the vertebrae. So this is posterior back here. This is anterior here. And so here's our abdominal pelvic cavity that is lined with our serous membrane or peritoneal membrane. And so, like I mentioned, there are some coils of the small intestine, etc., that go retroperitoneal, that go back behind it as well. So they wouldn't have that serous membrane on the surface of them, but most of our organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity do. Now that peritoneal membrane is made to be slippery so that things can move past one another. But if you have an infection, for some reason, like a bacterial infection in there, that can lead to swelling, itis, of the peritoneum. So peritonitis is inflammation of the peritoneum, and if that gets inflamed, then all those activities, just like if you get a blister wearing a shoe, like you're hiking or something like that, now you have that extra swelling, that extra inflammation there, and it's going to continue to rub, and it's going to generate damage to the tissues. So not only do you have an infection, but those different organs, as they're moving, are going to stick together. And so that can be the infection's a problem, but it can also be very, very painful because now the movements are not as smooth as they should be. So a bacterial infection in that abdominal pelvic cavity can be quite a problem because it can actually spread in amongst all those little coils and nooks and crannies and stuff like that. And I don't know, you always hear that phrase, like, is there ever a nook without a cranny? Like, what's the deal there? Just crannies? Just nooks? I don't know. Anyway. All right. So, still in big picture, before we get to individual organs, this is just reminding us what luckily we've already seen in terms of the organization of the histology of that alimentary canal. The fact that this muscular tube generally has 4 different layers to it, right? So on the inside, right, where the food is, we're going to have a mucosa. And that's where we're going to have commonly our simple columnar epithelium. Now it changes, right? As we get towards the outside, it always changes. So for instance, in the mouth, we actually have stratified squamous epithelium because there's the potential for damage there, right? If you have rough things like, sharp potato chips or something like that you're putting in your mouth, you want to make sure it doesn't pierce all the way through. And so you have multiple layers there. But as we get down towards the stomach and below, simple squamous epithelium making up our mucosa. A muscularis mucosa just underneath that can change the inner shape lining of that. Submucosa is where we have oftentimes our different glands that are producing secretions like the duodenal glands that will dump into the lumen there. Muscularis externa, or tunica muscularis, remember it has 2 layers to it. Longitudinal layer on the outside and a circular layer on the inside. That's consistent throughout most of our GI tract, right? Now we do know the stomach has 3 layers to it. It has an oblique layer as well. In addition, when we're talking about the mouth and the esophagus, it has a muscular lining, but it's actually skeletal muscle instead, right? Because when you are doing ingestion, you want voluntary control of that, right? So you want to know, okay, I'm done chewing this. I'm ready for another bite. I feel like it's small enough and it's mashed up enough with the saliva that I can send it down, right? So you choose when to send it down. Your pharynx is skeletal muscle. Your esophagus, the first part of it is skeletal muscle, but as it goes down, it actually transitions from skeletal muscle down to smooth muscle. Right? So if you've ever swallowed something that was a little too big, a little bit too rough or something like that, you can actually feel it, right? You can feel it go all the way down until it gets to the stomach. And now the stomach widens so you can't feel it anymore. But the beginning of it was skeletal muscle voluntary, but the rest of it is just that peristaltic squeezing movement. So that's smooth muscle that's sending it down further. And that continues in the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine. So that's where we have our smooth muscle. And then on the very outside, of course, we have our serosa, right? Our serous membrane on the outside is going to be our simple squamous epithelium there. So that's pretty much standard, as we mentioned, throughout the stomach or the intestine, etc. This one was just giving us a little bit more information about that intrinsic enteric nervous system, so the intrinsic nervous system. Because as we were looking at it, I'm going to jump back to that previous slide. As we were looking at the wall of it, see how there are nerves in the wall of it? All of those yellow things that we see there? Those are nerves, blood vessels and nerves that are going to be going through and commonly are going to be found in that submucosal layer. But the blood vessels, while they go to the submucosa, the nerves generally go to the muscularis. Right? Because they're going to be telling that muscularis layer when to contract, when to do rhythmic contractions like propulsion, when to do more churning or segmentation like digestive actions instead. So in fact, those nerve plexuses that we see here, those nerve plexuses, there's kind of 2 different types of nerve plexuses there that are part of that enteric nervous system. There's the myenteric and then the submucosal nerve plexus. And when we look at those as part of the enteric nervous system, remember that the submucosa has a lot of glands to it. So we need to be able to tell those glands, oh, guess what? We put a lot of food down there. We need some of your secretions to help with it, right? So like the duodenal glands that we saw in the microscope, that helps us to recognize that we're looking at a duodenal slide. We only need duodenal glands secreting when there's that acidic soup coming in from the stomach. So if there's no new food coming in from the stomach for whatever reason, those duodenal glands need to take a break. But when new food arrives, oh my gosh, we need to neutralize that acidic acid by definition, that acidic chyme that's coming down from the stomach, that stomach acid, and so we need those glands to get a signal to contract. So submucosal nerve plexus often controls a lot of the glandular secretion as well as a little bit of smooth muscle like the muscularis mucosa. And then the myenteric nerve plexus, so the my or myo, that refers to muscle. So that's the part of the enteric nervous system that coordinates the mobility or the propulsive movements that are occurring inside of the stomach wall. So again, if the duodenum needs to communicate back to the stomach, it says to the stomach, hey, I'm busy here, I need you to slow down. That is going to slow down the muscular activity of the stomach wall, and it's going to slow down the secretion in the stomach wall, etc., until the duodenum is ready again. So those nerve plexuses help to coordinate the activity of these different segments of the digestive tract. Okay? Okay. So both internal control, intrinsic, enteric, as well as extrinsic control coming from that central nervous system. All right. So what we've done so far is we've done big picture things. We've looked at the different digestive processes, what they are and where they occur. We've looked at a brief tour of those different organs of the digestive system like we looked at in lab, but we haven't talked a lot about what they do and what their kind of detailed structure is, so that's coming up. We've laid out kind of how this system is coordinated by the nervous system in terms of extrinsic and intrinsic control. We've looked at the wall a little bit of our muscular tube, seeing how it has those 4 layers to it and things like that. So what we've done so far is just overall system. So now what we'll do is, we'll just do it step by step. Much like a food particle that's coming into your digestive system, we will follow it along and address and look at those different digestive organs and talk about kind of what they are and what they do. Okay? So luckily in lab, we've looked at some of those already. So the structures, the names of the organs and the parts of them and stuff like that, you should be already familiar with. But we'll talk about kind of why they're shaped that way or what they contribute to the digestive process coming up. Before I do that though, questions about what we've seen so far? Okay. All right, so like muscular activity of your digestive system, how about some muscular activity of your body overall? How about everybody stand up for just a second and do a little bit of movement, because I've been talking at you as we come back to spring break. You don't have to stand up if you don't want, but just do a little bit of stretching and moving around a little bit before we start talking about those other things. It's always good to do. Make sure that everything's still working. We know that muscular activity is good for moving lymph and blood and things like that. So, all right. And more fluid going into the system. That's a good thing too. Okay. So following along in terms of our digestive system, as we were talking about ingestion, that's going into the mouth. So a lot of what we see here, you're familiar with already. The teeth, the tongue, the oral cavity with its hard palate, its soft palate, its uvula hanging down in the back. We see some of our different tonsils that are there because, again, this is a place where our body might be attacked quite readily because of things that are attached to the food or didn't get totally cooked or something like that, right? So we want to have some of our protective structures there. We see how, as we get back to the pharynx, again, we have our oropharynx and our laryngopharynx before we follow down this way into the esophagus itself. Now, this view of our oral cavity gives us a different view of some of our structures that maybe we couldn't see in that mid-sagittal view. We can see our teeth, and we'll talk about our teeth coming up, different types of teeth, right? So we'll address that coming up. We can also see with our tongue there, tongue has a certain role to play in terms of digestive processes as well. Not only is it going to be moving the food around because we want to move it to our different teeth that have different actions in terms of physical digestion, but we have a number of chemoreceptors that are located in the mouth, in the pharynx, as well as in the nose that will help to tell us what's in the food and whether that food is attractive, what that food may contain, and whether it meets the needs that we have at the time, right? So the tongue has a good role to play there as well. You can see some openings down below here, right? So it says duct of submandibular gland. What type of gland is a submandibular gland? It's a salivary gland, right? So we saw that there are 3 different types of salivary glands, right? We have parotid salivary glands, the big ones here, inferior to the ear. We have submandibular underneath the jaw, and then we have sublingual, remember, underneath the tongue. And remember, to see the difference between submandibular and sublingual, we had to look at that half head of the torso model where you could pull out the tongue and see those 2 separate ones. But all of those are going to release saliva in to mix with the mouth. So the submandibular glands are the ones that are underneath the jaw. They have openings underneath the tongue. Those are the ones that you leak from. You ever done that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're like really excited about eating something, or you're like looking at it, you're like, oh, this is going to be sour or something like that, and all of a sudden, it shoots out from those submandibular glands. So if your tongue is raised, usually your tongue's in place, it's going to block that. But if your tongue is raised and it happens to hit at the right time, it's like a sprinkler and actually can shoot out. Some people can control that. It's a very interesting, unique talent. But all of the different glands are going to be secreting. Now, submandibular are under the sublingual are under the tongue. Interestingly enough, the parotid salivary glands, they release superiorly, up by some of the molars that we find on the maxilla instead. But all those are going to be washing around inside of the mouth so that we can be mixing that with the food. So back to the tongue, just briefly. The tongue is a very muscular organ. They would say that the tongue is the most active muscle, one of the most active muscles. Extrinsic eye muscles are super active as well because when you're sleeping, right? Well, a lot of your other muscles may be not moving. Your eyes, you have rapid eye movements as well. So even when you're sleeping, those muscles are moving. But the tongue is very active as well. They consider it to be very powerful with its muscles, both intrinsic, to change the shape of the tongue, and extrinsic, to move the tongue around the mouth itself. So both of those are important in terms of speech as well as moving food around, etc. And sometimes you see that there are connections to the tongue. That little connection point that you see underneath here is called the frenulum. So there are frenula that hold the tongue in place. There are also frenula that hold the lips in place. These are called labial frenula that hold the lips. So it gives them some flexibility, but it also holds them so they don't go flapping all over the place. Same thing with the tongue. We want the tongue to be able to move inside the oral cavity, but we don't want it to slide back down into the pharynx and block our respiratory passage. So that's kind of the anchor for it that we see right there. There is a case that you can hear about. You've heard the phrase, maybe somebody is tongue-tied. Usually you're talking about like, oh, I can't speak very well and stuff like that. So that actually ties to a condition where that lingual frenulum is too short. So the tongue is now restricted in terms of its movement. So it can't, somebody who has a short lingual frenulum can't speak very well because the tongue helps us to make those different noises, and it can restrict the movements in terms of digestion as well. So if they have a short lingual frenulum, they may put a cut in it to loosen the tongue a little bit that way. Anyway, other interesting aspects of the tongue. Muscular, to be sure, move things around. It also has some secretion. So there's certain mucus that's going to be secreted for sure. But there's also secretion of our first enzyme that's called lingual lipase. So a lot of our enzymes end in that suffix ase. So this is an enzyme that works to digest. Morning lab people know, what does it digest? Lipids, right? So lingual lipase comes from the tongue and aids in the chemical digestion of lipids. In fact, there are a number of different nutrient molecules, different organic nutrient molecules that we'll be talking about. So there's certainly lipids, but there's also carbohydrates and proteins and even nucleic acids. And so in order to break down the macromolecules, the big molecule forms of these nutrient molecules, we have to have enzymes to do that, to chemically digest them. And so the very first one that comes into play is lingual lipase that helps us to start breaking down lipids or fats that we take in. Okay? So there's not a lot, but it helps to start this process. So for digestion, we're going to see chemical digestion a little bit occurring in the mouth, fats coming from the tongue, and then we'll also see a little bit more chemical digestion from another enzyme coming in as well. Now the tongue itself, it's not entirely smooth. One of its roles is to move the food all around, and so it needs a little bit of traction to be able to do that. So there are bumps all over the tongue, and in fact there are different types of bumps. All of those bumps are called papillae, and we have different types of bumps. So the most common type, the smallest type, are called filiform papillae. And these are the ones that are just there for traction or friction, so that we can grip the food item and push it around to the different teeth so the teeth can do their job in terms of physical digestion. So they give the tongue that roughness like that. And in fact, if you look at other animals like dogs and cats, right? They have very long papillae, because what are cats doing and dogs doing? They're using their tongues to bathe themselves as well, right? So they're using those longer papillae as a brush or a comb to help grab hair and remove that from their body. And of course, if it's a cat, then they're going to like ingest it a bit and then have that big hairball show up on your bed a little bit later. So for the most part, the most numerous papillae are the filiform papillae. They're there for friction, but there are a few other types as well. These mushroom-shaped ones called fungiform and circumvallate or valate papillae that are towards the back of the tongue. So all of these little pointy ones that we see here in the scanning electron micrograph, these are filiform papillae for traction, but the larger ones that we see either towards the back, there's the circumvallate ones, or these larger ones that we see here. Those ones are housing our taste receptors, our chemoreceptors that give us taste. So a lot of our taste receptors are located on the tongue. Some of them are around the oral cavity. You can get some in the oral cavity, even some back on the pharynx. And those are where our chemoreceptors are located for taste. So we have, right? What are our different special sense tastes that we have? So we have sweet, bitter, salty, sour, and umami is like the fifth one that they developed and discovered only like, I don't know, a decade or so ago, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, at least in Western science. But those different taste receptors, and they're still working on other ones, there's a question about whether there's a fat taste receptor, whether there's a water taste receptor as well. But those give us an indication about what is in the food. Because like we said, it's very important to meet the nutritional needs that we have. So for instance, the umami receptor is for savory. Savory comes from amino acids. Now there's one amino acid that kind of sets it off, but amino acids are digestive products of proteins. So if you can taste something that's very meaty or savory, you know that there's a lot of protein in it. So back before you had a store that had labels on everything, if you were just going out and foraging and you need to meet your nutritional needs, I need electrolytes, I need proteins, I need carbohydrates or something like that, how are you going to tell? You're going to taste it, right? So if you taste it and it tastes kind of savory, like, oh, this is protein, right? I need protein, I'm going to eat more of this. If you taste something that's salty, you need electrolytes, sodium, chloride, potassium, like we've seen. So if you need electrolytes, something that's salty, all of us go through periods of time where we're like, I don't know, I just need some salty foods. I need some salty foods. That's probably part of a feedback mechanism that says, oh, maybe there's a little bit of imbalance in terms of electrolytes. So sour has to do with pH. So very, very more acidic things will get those sour receptors to go off. And again, pH in the body is something that we control as well. And then bitter. Bitter often has to do with toxic compounds. So bitter, rather than something that would lead you to eat more of that item, if something's especially bitter and you didn't know what it was, you're like, ugh, that's too bitter. Probably there's some sort of plant toxins or toxic compounds in there that you don't want to eat. So that's also important to know, right? So we're giving our body this information about what's in this potential food item and whether it's going to meet the needs of our body at the time. Okay, so our circumambulate papillae and our fungiform papillae, those are the ones that house our different taste receptors. Okay, so we're in the mouth, we were talking about lips, we were talking about tongue, talking about salivary glands. So the different salivary glands that we have there, as we mentioned, are going to produce a secretion, saliva, that cleanses the mouth. It moistens and dissolves the food chemicals. So that's pretty important in various ways, not only to protect the body, but also, those different chemicals that we were talking about that are inside of the food items, they need to be able to get down to where those chemoreceptors are. When we look at those different types of our papillae, if we're looking at it from the side, a fungiform papilla looks like this, kind of like a mushroom. That's where it gets its name. Well, in the lining of it, along the sides here, is where we actually have the taste buds. They're not on the top, where the food goes. They're along the side over here. So the food might be up here, but until those molecules can get down here, you're not going to taste it. So by mixing it with the saliva, as you're chewing it up, and getting kind of those pieces of it broken down and mixed with the saliva, it will kind of sink down, and now it can interact with those chemoreceptors to tell you what you're tasting. If those chemoreceptors are covered with a lot of mucus because you're sick, can't get to it, can't taste very well. If something that you're eating is very dry and you don't have a lot of saliva, again, it may not get down to those chemoreceptors, and so you don't really taste it. And so one of the other regular stories that I tell is that at one time there was a show that was called Duck Quacks Don't Echo. It was like on the Discovery Channel or something like that. And they had a couple of hosts who were actually comedians, but they would investigate little scientific oddities. And one of them was talking about the fact that if you have something totally dry, without mixing with the saliva, you can't taste it. So what they did is they had these Q-tips that had different types of chemicals on them, whether it was like vanilla or cinnamon or, like we said, like a meat broth or something like that. And what they would do is they would blindfold one of the guys, and then they would take the Q-tip with the tasting on it, and they would put it in the mouth and they go, oh, yeah, so that is sour, or that is, sugar or something like that. But then what they did is they took like a swab and they dried out the host's mouth, and they used the same Q-tips and they put it in there, and without that saliva, without that fluid, they couldn't taste it, and they had a clip on the nose as well. So without that saliva mixing with it, it wouldn't be able to get down to those chemoreceptors, and so they missed it every single time because the salivary glands weren't able to do their job, mix with the food, and get it down to those different types of taste receptors. Okay. So where we made it so far is that we have made it to the salivary glands. Where we'll pick up is that the salivary glands can put out another enzyme called amylase that helps to chemically digest another one of our food products. And then we'll continue moving along. We'll move from the mouth, go to the pharynx, go to the esophagus, and kind of move along as well. But we're kind of out of time this time, so we'll just, wherever we drop off, we'll continue to move, just like your food moves on through.